Competition in the music streaming service market is hotter than ever, but most of the available services seem to have pretty similar marketing points, with over 100 million songs, most of them having lossless streaming available as well now. So which one is actually the best? Well, in the previous video, we did a bit of a deep dive into Spotify and Apple Music, and today we're going to be doing a deep dive into Tidal and Qobuz. If you haven't yet seen the first video, I would recommend going and watching the Spotify versus Apple Music video, as it talks through some of the experiments that we'll be doing again in this video. We're going to be comparing Tidal and Qobuz in terms of sound quality, library size, and looking at some of the extra features that they offer. Let's start with the music library. This is a bit of a tricky one because most services, including both Tidal and Qobuz, advertise themselves as having over 100 million songs, and that's great, but it doesn't actually really give you a particularly real-world view of how likely you are to find your music in your library available on those platforms. So to come up with a bit of a real-world experiment, I asked DMS and Resolve to each give me a playlist of songs that they listen to regularly from various different genres, and made one myself as well. And then I simply looked at what songs from these playlists were available or missing from each platform. The three playlists have quite a wide variety of genres in them, but bear in mind this is a fairly small sample size for a test, so it's meant to be a bit more real world than just looking at the 100 million number, but it's not necessarily going to apply directly to what you listen to. I'll start things off with the good stuff. Tidal joins Apple Music and Spotify in having an absolutely excellent library, finding 100% of songs on all three playlists. Qobuz, on the other hand, has improved its library quite significantly in the last 2 years or so. It used to be quite restrictive, to the point that whilst a lot of people I know would use it for the high-res streaming, as at the time it was one of the only services that had high-res streaming available, but they would still need to keep a subscription to something else to find all of the stuff that was not available on Qobuz. And that has improved quite a bit, but it's not quite perfect yet. Qobuz was missing 5 out of the just over 80 songs that we tested, for a 94% find rate in total. So overall, Tidal gets the win for library size. You won't have any issue finding what you want on there. Qobuz, most stuff will be available, but there will be a song or two missing here and there. As we discussed in the last video, streaming services like Tidal and Qobuz are generally not intentionally changing how a track sounds. They're not going to be EQing things, for example. And whilst they have guidelines for things like loudness, for instance, they're not going to be changing things to conform with those. They are just guidelines, and artists and labels are free to ignore them. But even if an artist or label gives the exact same identical copy of a file to 2 different streaming services, there are 2 factors that might affect what it sounds like when you play it back. The first big factor is simply, is the music streaming service you're using compressing the music that it's streaming to you? This was a big factor in the Apple Music versus Spotify debate, because Apple Music just takes the exact same file that the artist or label gave them and streams it directly unchanged to the listener. Whereas Spotify, in order to save on bandwidth and data, compresses the music, so information is lost and then it streams that to the listener. Sometimes compression can be done very well, to the point that it's almost indistinguishable from a lossless version. You might not have noticed that I actually turned down the bitrate for my audio in this section of the video, for instance. But if you compress things too much, it starts to get quite a bit more obvious. Luckily, we don't have to worry about any of that with Tidal or Qobuz, because both of these services offer lossless streaming. In fact, not just lossless, but high-res streaming, meaning tracks for where it's available up to 192 kHz, 24-bit, can be streamed completely uncompressed straight to the listener. That would not have been the case, though, if this video were made even just a couple months ago, because whilst Qobuz has always had lossless and high-res streaming available, Tidal, whilst it had lossless streaming for a lot of its library, in place of high-res, it used MQA, or Master Quality Authenticated. This was a file format that purported to offer lossless high-res quality in a smaller file format, but in order to use it fully, you had to buy a device which had MQA compatibility, and that meant that that device had a licensing fee to MQA baked in as well. The problem was, MQA, as it turns out, didn't do half of what it claimed to do. Most of the marketing claims were complete junk, and you can watch my video on the topic here, where I actually published music on Tidal to get a deep dive objective look at exactly what was going on. The other problem with MQA on Tidal being that even if you didn't have the subscription tier that allowed you to use MQA, or if you just selected I just want lossless in the quality settings, it would still just stream you the MQA file but with flagging removed so that your DAC didn't realize it was MQA. For any track where there was an MQA copy available, there was no way to stream a lossless copy from Tidal. Earlier on this year though, MQA Limited became insolvent and went into administration, and shortly thereafter, Tidal announced that they are moving away from using MQA.
Well, I've got to look pleased now, haven't I, without being smug?
Yeah, you're not pulling that off.
The MQA files are being removed, and in their place you will be able to stream native high-res files, and the 44.1 kHz stuff that got converted to MQA for no good reason is being restored back to the actual lossless versions. So now, both Tidal and Qobuz offer high-res, lossless streaming. But the second factor is, even if the streaming service is giving you a lossless file, can you play that file bit perfect and lossless? Can you play it without your machine actually changing stuff? And in the previous video, we talked about how Apple Music, for instance, even though it's streaming a lossless file to you, cannot play lossless on Android or Windows, and even on Mac, you actually need to do a bit of tweaking in order to get it to play losslessly as well. This is the results chart that we ended up with, and now we're going to add Tidal and Qobuz to this list. On iOS, due to the way that the audio stack in the operating system is set up, luckily both services can play proper lossless music straight to your DAC, providing that you have the volume all the way up. If you turn it down, then obviously it's changing things because it's altering the volume, but if you have volume at max, it is indeed bit perfect for both Tidal and Qobuz. On Android though, there's a bit of a problem, which is that the Android operating system resamples all audio to 48 kHz, which means most music, which is 44.1 kHz, gets changed and resampled to 48 kHz. And even if you have a high-res file, say 192 kHz being streamed to you, you can't really take advantage of it because it's just being downsampled to 48 kHz before being fed to your device. Unfortunately, that is the case for Qobuz here, so on Android, Qobuz cannot play lossless music at all. Tidal, on the other hand though, has managed to get around this with a clever USB driver. You can connect an external USB DAC to your phone, and the operating system will ask you if you'd like to give Tidal exclusive access to that device, and if you do, Tidal can then output to that USB DAC, bypassing the operating system mixer entirely. Nothing gets resampled, it can play all of your music lossless all the way up to high-res without being changed. There is a slight workaround for Qobuz, which is that if you stream Qobuz rather than using the official app using USB Audio Player Pro or Rune Arc, both of those will allow you to output, as Tidal does, bit perfect to a USB device. But just talking about the stock app itself, Qobuz cannot play lossless on Android. On macOS, both services can play lossless, but only if you manually go into MIDI settings and change the sample rate of your output device to match what you are playing through the streaming service. If you don't do this, then the operating system will resample your audio before feeding it to the DAC. And unfortunately, whilst there's a really handy tool for Apple Music specifically called Lossless Switcher, which will automate this process for you so you don't even need to touch anything, that doesn't work, as far as I'm aware anyway, for Tidal and Qobuz, which means if you want to play lossless on Mac, you do need to be changing your output settings pretty frequently. On Windows PCs, the normal method of outputting audio is for a program to hand off audio to the OS mixer, which is a service that mixes all of the different audio coming from all of the different programs together, resamples it if necessary, and then outputs it to your device. But the problem is, even if there is just one program running, your sample rate is set correctly, it's not bit perfect. It does alter the audio that is going through it. So in order to play bit perfect on Windows, you need to use an exclusive output option. But whereas Apple Music didn't have a way to play bit perfect and lossless on Windows, both Tidal and Qobuz support Wasapi exclusive, which allows them to take exclusive control of any USB DAC, change the sample rate of that DAC, and output bit perfect no matter what they're playing. One last thing to mention is that all of the results in this chart are assuming you have volume normalization turned off in your music streaming service. A lot of streaming services will enable this by default. It gives more consistent volume between tracks, but it does mean that they are altering the volume of those tracks. If you want to play back things completely unaltered, make sure you go in and turn this off. But what about extra features? Last time we discussed Apple Music's dedicated classical music app, for instance, Spotify's Connect utility, audiobook service, and recommendation algorithm. So what about Tidal and Qobuz? Well, when it comes to extra features, neither of these two services are really doing anything all that unique, except for one feature they both share that I'll talk about shortly. Tidal offers the ability to browse and watch music videos in the app, and Qobuz is not just a streaming service, but also allows you to purchase, download, and keep your music. Tidal also has something similar to Spotify Connect called Tidal Connect, which allows people to stream music to various different streaming devices if they support it, though both Tidal and Qobuz also support DNLA casting by default anyway. Let's talk about something which is possibly the most important feature for many people, the recommendation algorithm. Now, this is something which is a little bit tricky to objectively quantify. I can only give you my thoughts on the matter, but as someone who uses both of these services and has done for years, Tidal in particular has gotten really good in this area. It used to be that I found it inferior to Spotify, for instance, but now it's gotten really good to the point that it's on par, maybe even better, although I have used Spotify less in recent months. It offers My Mix playlists with different moods, so you can get personalized recommendations no matter what you're looking for in that moment, as well as suggested new releases from artists it thinks you'll enjoy. And generally, the recommendations have been spot on. There's also plenty of easy-to-use browsing features for charts, editorial picks, and browsing high-res only tracks. Qobuz, on the other hand, unfortunately really falls behind here. It used to be for a long time that Qobuz didn't really have recommendations at all, besides some editorial playlists, and even though it now has a My Weekly Q playlist, personally I've found the results I've gotten from it to be pretty hit or miss, and it's often very pop music dominated, no matter what you actually listen to. There's also a bit of weirdness going on with manual browsing sometimes, where if two artists have the same name, the service gets a bit confused. See this example with Bob Moses, an electronic duo that I listen to a fair bit, and Qobuz thinks that they're the same as a drummer called Bob Moses, and also mixes their discographies together. So in terms of music discovery, there is no competition. Tidal wins this one hands down. The feature that both of these services share though, and pretty much the whole reason that I use these two in particular, is that they have Roon integration. Roon is a music player that seamlessly blends your local and online libraries, provides a wealth of browsing and filtering options, a powerful DSP suite. It's something of the standard for high-end audio network streaming setups, and also in my experience has simply the best recommendations of any service. They've been better than any streaming service's own recommendations, including Tidal and Qobuz, despite the fact that I'm streaming Tidal and Qobuz through Roon, and the new releases for you section is even more personalized than Tidal's, for example, and can be split into albums and singles. It's just the best way to actually explore, customize, and enjoy listening to music, in my opinion. And this isn't sponsored, Roon is just great. These two streaming services having integration with it means that even if the streaming service is lacking a particular feature, like decent recommendations, built-in EQ, or music credits detailed enough to tell you specifically who was playing the electric banjo in that track, Roon will handle it. Both of these services are better than they are by themselves if you use them with Roon, but just comparing them standalone, I think due to the combination of Tidal Connect, better recommendations, better manual browsing, and an overall nicer UI in my view, Tidal wins hands down. In the past, when people asked me what streaming service should I use, I recommended Qobuz. It was basically the only option if you wanted actual lossless streaming. Deezer didn't have and still doesn't have a bit-perfect output, Apple Music didn't exist, and Tidal had all sorts of problems at the time. But now things have changed and there's more competition. Tidal themselves have drastically improved their service by getting rid of MQA, adding high-res streaming, adding bit-perfect support on Android, improving their recommendation algorithm, and now there really isn't much reason not to go with Tidal. I hope you enjoyed that video and found it useful, and if you've got any questions left over about music streaming services, music gear, or anything else at all, head over to the Headphones.com Discord server or the Headphones.com forum, and I and other Wiggly Air enthusiasts will endeavour to help. Until next time, thanks for watching.